The ship that arrived at Earth's doorstep was beautiful. It was long and silver, shaped like a leaf falling through water, and it moved without sound through the black emptiness of space. It belonged to the Galactic Concord, an alliance of 42 alien species that had ruled the Orion arm of the galaxy for over 12,000 years. They had come to meet humanity. They had come because they felt sorry for them. Ambassador Thiel Voss stood at the observation deck of the vessel and looked down at the blue planet below. She was Raythari, tall, thin, with a hard exoskeleton that shimmered like polished bronze, and 4 arms that moved with a dancer's grace. Her compound eyes reflected the planet in 1,000 tiny images. Earth, the homeworld of the newest species to achieve faster-than-light travel. She had studied the reports, she had read the biological data, and she had felt something close to sadness. Their skin could be cut with a blade no thicker than a leaf. They had no natural armor, no venom, no telepathy, no ability to regenerate lost limbs. They lived for less than a century, a blink of an eye compared to most Concord species. Their bones were brittle. Their eyes could only see a tiny part of the light spectrum. They could not survive in vacuum for even a minute. And their planet was a nightmare. It shook with earthquakes. It drowned them with floods. It burned them with volcanoes. It froze them, boiled them, and threw storms at them that could flatten cities. The animals on their world had claws and teeth and venom of their own. By every measure the Concord used to evaluate a species, humans should have gone extinct millions of years ago. Yet here they were, somehow. Thiel's shuttle descended through the atmosphere and docked at the human orbital station called Pinnacle. It was made of gray metal and sharp angles, functional and plain, like a tool built to do a job, and nothing more. She found this fitting. The human delegation was waiting in a wide room with a long table. There were 7 of them, dressed in dark uniforms. They stood when she entered. At the center of the group was a man named Admiral Cale Marin. He was not tall by Raythari standards. His hair was gray at the temples. There was a scar that ran from his left eyebrow down to his jaw, a pale, jagged line against dark skin. His eyes were calm and steady, the color of storm clouds, and when he shook her hand, his grip was firm, but not aggressive. "Welcome to our home, Ambassador," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled. Thiel inclined her head. "The Concord is pleased to meet humanity at last. We have watched your progress with great interest." This was a polite lie. The Concord had watched with concern, not interest. The debate among the Axis of Elders, the ruling council, had been long and difficult. 42 species had weighed in on the question of what to do with humanity. The answer, reached by near unanimous vote, was simple. Humans needed help. They needed protection. They needed a patron. The patron system was old and well established. When a weak species joined the Concord, a stronger species was assigned to guide them, to shield them from the dangers of a galaxy that did not care about fragile things. It was considered an act of kindness, a gift. Thiel delivered the news with what she believed was warmth. "The Concord has assigned the Draelith as your patron species. They are among our oldest and most powerful members. They will provide military protection, technological guidance, and diplomatic support as you find your place in the galaxy." She expected gratitude. She expected relief. What she got was silence. Admiral Marin looked at her for a long moment. The other humans exchanged glances. Small movements, a raised eyebrow here, a tightened jaw there. Thiel could not read their expressions well. Human faces were strangely mobile, full of tiny muscles that shifted and pulled in ways she found difficult to interpret. Then Marin smiled. It was a small smile, polite and closed, and it did not reach his eyes. "We accept," he said, "and we thank the Concord for its generosity." That should have been the end of it. A simple diplomatic exchange, a weak species accepting the help of a strong one. Thiel should have returned to her ship, filed her report, and moved on to the next assignment. But something about that smile stayed with her. It was not the smile of a grateful species. It was not the smile of relief. It was the smile of a man who knew something she did not, and had decided for reasons of his own not to share it. That night, alone in her quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel, Thiel accessed humanity's public archive. She told herself it was routine, a final review before filing her assessment. She began with their biology, their geography, their art. All interesting, all unremarkable by galactic standards. Then she found the section on history. She opened it casually, expecting the usual story: tribal conflicts, slow unification, the gradual building of civilization that every species went through. She expected perhaps a few hundred years of recorded conflict, as was typical. The file was enormous. She began reading. She read about a war that lasted 100 years. She read about a war that spread across their entire world. Twice. She read about weapons that could flatten cities in a single flash of light. And she learned that humans had built these weapons and pointed them at each other and had come within minutes of using them to end their own civilization. She read about soldiers who charged into certain death because someone told them to. She read about civilians who picked up weapons and fought armies. She read about sieges that lasted years, about retreats through frozen wastelands, about people who set themselves on fire rather than surrender. She read for hours. The file never seemed to end. Every species in the Concord had a history of conflict. It was natural. It was expected. But this was something else entirely. This was not a species that had experienced war. This was a species that had been forged by it. War was not an event in human history. It was the thread that ran through everything, the furnace that had shaped every institution, every invention, every instinct they possessed. Thiel set down her datapad. Her 4 hands were trembling. She thought about Admiral Marin's smile. She thought about the scar on his face, and the calm in his eyes, and the way he had accepted the Concord's protection, the way a grown adult might accept a child's offer to guard them from the dark. She opened her personal log and began recording her private assessment. Her voice was not steady. "I have made a preliminary error in my evaluation," she said. "The humans are not what we believed. I do not yet know what they are, but I am beginning to suspect that we have made a terrible mistake, not in offering them protection, but in assuming they needed it." She paused. The stars outside her window burned cold and white and endless. "I am afraid," she whispered, "and I do not yet fully understand why." The Dralith fleet arrived in the Sol system 6 months later. 12 warships, each one the size of a small moon, black and heavy and covered in weapons that glowed like embers. They moved through space the way predators moved through water, slow, certain, and without fear. Warlord Kazan Drael stood on the bridge of his flagship and stared at the pale blue dot that was Earth. He was not impressed. He was Dralith, a species of towering reptilian warriors who had fought in 100 wars across 10,000 years. His scales were dark green, thick as ship plating, and his eyes were gold with vertical slits. He stood nearly 3 meters tall. His claws could tear through metal. His species could survive in vacuum for short periods, and could heal from wounds that would kill most other beings in the galaxy. He had been assigned to protect humans. He considered it an insult. A babysitting mission, he had told his second-in-command when the orders came. "They give me the weakest species in the Concord, and expect me to pretend it is an honor." His second-in-command, a scarred female named Vreth, had said nothing. She had read Ambassador Thiel's private report, the one that had been flagged and quietly circulated among Dralith military intelligence. She had found it interesting. Kazan had not bothered to read it. He would regret that. The first week was what Kazan expected. He toured human cities and found them noisy and chaotic. He visited human hospitals and was shocked by how easily their bodies broke. He watched humans eat and was amazed by the sheer variety of poisons they willingly consumed: caffeine, capsaicin, alcohol, things that would kill a Drelith in minutes. When he pointed this out, the humans laughed. They thought it was funny. He did not understand them. On the 8th day, Admiral Marin invited him to visit a military academy. Kazan agreed, expecting something pitiful. A few hundred soft creatures learning to point weapons they barely understood. What he found was different. The academy was built into the side of a mountain. It was cold and hard and functional. There were no decorations, no banners, no displays of glory. Just stone and steel, and thousands of young humans training as if their lives depended on it. Because, as Kazan would soon learn, humans always trained as if their lives depended on it. He watched cadets run through obstacle courses that would challenge even Drelith recruits. He watched them fight hand-to-hand in a style that was brutal and efficient, with no wasted movement. He watched them practice with weapons, not just the energy rifles the Concorde used, but older things: projectile weapons, blades, explosives, things the Concorde had abandoned centuries ago. But what truly caught his attention was the simulation room. Inside, cadets were running through combat scenarios. Not normal scenarios, nightmare scenarios. One group was practicing fighting in total darkness, blind, using only sound and touch. Another group was drilling for a situation where their commanding officers were dead, their communications were jammed, and they were surrounded on all sides with no ammunition. A third group was rehearsing what to do if their own allies turned against them. Kazan watched this last group for a long time. Then he turned to Admiral Marin, who stood beside him with his hands clasped behind his back, his face calm and unreadable. "Why do you train for betrayal by your own allies?" Kazan asked. Marin looked at him. "Because it has happened before. And the scenario with no communications, no officers, no ammunition, that has also happened before. The darkness training, many times." Kazan felt something shift inside his chest. It was small, like a crack forming in stone. "You prepare for situations that are statistically impossible." "No," Marin said quietly. "We prepare for situations that have already occurred. The universe is not kind enough to only hurt you in new ways. It likes to repeat itself." That evening, Kazan asked to see more of human history. Not the public version, the real one. Marin agreed without hesitation, as if he had been waiting for the request. They sat in a small dark room, and Marin showed him everything. He showed him the trenches of a war where millions died fighting over a few miles of mud. He showed him a city turned to glass and shadow by a single bomb that split the atom itself. He showed him images of soldiers storming beaches under a rain of bullets so thick the sand turned red. He showed him guerrilla fighters in jungles who defeated armies 10 times their size, using nothing but patience, knowledge of the land, and a refusal to stop fighting. He showed him a frozen retreat where soldiers wrapped dead men's clothing around their own feet to keep walking. He showed him people who survived in camps designed to destroy them, and came out the other side, still standing, still human, still unbroken. Kazan watched all of it. He said nothing for a long time. Finally he spoke. "You did all of this to each other?" "Yes," Marin said. "Your own species?" "Yes." "And you survived?" Marin looked at him, and for the first time, Kazan saw something behind those calm gray eyes, something deep and old and very, very dangerous. "We did more than survive, Warlord. We learned." Kazan returned to his flagship that night and locked himself in his quarters. He sat in the dark for an hour, thinking. Then he opened a secure channel to Drelith High Command and began recording a classified report. His voice was different now. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something his officers had never heard from him before. Caution. "I have completed my initial assessment of the human species," he said. "The Concorde's classification of them as a Class 9 vulnerable species is incorrect. I do not yet know what the correct classification should be. Their bodies are weak. Their lifespans are short. They have no natural weapons worth mentioning." He paused. His golden eyes stared at nothing. "But they have been fighting since before they could write. They have been killing since before they had metal. Every generation of their species has known war. Not border skirmishes, not ritual combat. Total war. The kind that burns cities and reshapes continents. And each time, they came back stronger, smarter, more dangerous." He leaned forward. "We were told to protect them. I am no longer certain they need it. I am no longer certain we can stop them if they disagreed with us. I am requesting that High Command review this assignment immediately. These creatures are not what we were told. They are not prey. They are something else entirely, and I do not have a word for it." He ended the transmission and sat in the silence of his quarters. Outside, Earth turned slowly in the dark, blue and green and white, beautiful and quiet, and full of 7 billion small, soft, impossibly dangerous creatures, who had spent their entire history preparing for a fight that had not yet come. 3 days later, that fight arrived. The emergency signal came from the Concorde's outer border. The Vraxith Dominion, a ruthless empire from beyond the galactic rim that had never been defeated, had declared war. They were already inside Concorde space. 3 systems had fallen in 2 days. The Concorde began mobilizing every fleet, every species, every warship it had. Humanity was told, politely but firmly, to stay behind the defensive line. They were too fragile, too inexperienced, too new. Admiral Marin received the order. He read it carefully. He set it down on his desk. Then he picked up his communicator and spoke 2 words that would change the history of the galaxy. Gray Dawn. Across human space, in asteroid belts and gas giant orbits, and hollowed-out moons and decommissioned mining stations, lights began turning on. Engines began warming up. Weapon systems that had never been fired began their startup sequences. Ships that no one in the galaxy knew existed began to move. Humanity had been told to stay behind. Humanity had other plans. The Thaline Corridor was supposed to hold. It was the strongest defensive position in Concorde space, a narrow passage between 2 massive nebulae, lined with orbital fortresses and minefields, and the combined fleets of 36 species. It had held against raiders and pirates for centuries. It was the wall behind which the civilized galaxy slept safely. The Vraxith broke through it in 9 hours. Ambassador Thiel watched from the bridge of a Concorde diplomatic cruiser as the battle unfolded on the tactical display. The screen was filled with red markers for Vraxith ships, red zones for lost territory, red warnings flashing at every corner. The Concorde fleet was falling apart. Ships that had never seen real combat were being torn to pieces by an enemy that had known nothing but war for its entire existence. The Vraxith were nightmares given form. They were tall and thin, with skin like dried leather stretched over sharp bones. Their ships were dark and fast and covered in weapons that fired beams of energy so hot they could melt through hull plating in seconds. They did not take prisoners. They did not negotiate. They consumed what they conquered and moved on to the next world. Thiel gripped the railing of the bridge as another Concorde ship vanished from the display. The Raythari vessel beside it was retreating. The Corvani battle group had been cut off. The Dralith were fighting hard. Kazan's ships were among the last still holding position, but even they were being pushed back. "How long until reinforcements arrive?" Thiel asked the ship's captain. The captain, a gray-furred Netheri with 6 eyes, did not look at her. There are no reinforcements, Ambassador. This was everything. Thiel felt cold. The Faline corridor was falling. Beyond it lay the core worlds, the home systems of species that had known peace for thousands of years. Billions of lives. And there was nothing between them and the Vraxith but empty space and broken ships. She thought of Earth. She thought of the soft, fragile species she had been sent to evaluate. At least they were safe, far behind the lines, tucked away where the war could not reach them. She was wrong. 6 hours after the corridor fell, the Vraxith dreadnoughts reformed and began their advance toward the core worlds. Their fleet was damaged, but still massive. Over 3,000 warships, moving in a formation that looked like a spear, pointed at the heart of civilization. The Concorde's surviving ships scattered before them, like leaves before a storm. There was no plan. There was no coordination. There was only fear. And then the sensors picked up something impossible. It came from above, from the galactic plane's upper boundary, a region of space filled with radiation so intense that no living crew could survive prolonged exposure. No fleet had ever used it as a travel route. No species had ever been desperate enough or crazy enough to try. But humans were not like other species. Humans had a different relationship with the word impossible. The first ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel like a stone falling from the sky. Then another, then 10, then 100, then 1,000. They kept coming, pouring out of the radiation belt in a torrent of metal and fire, spreading across the void in a formation that was wide and flat and perfectly positioned between the Vraxith armada and the retreating Concorde fleet. 2,047 human warships, every single one built in secret over the past 5 years in hidden shipyards scattered across human space. They were not beautiful ships. They were not elegant or graceful or designed to impress. They were ugly, angular, brutal things, gray and black, covered in weapons that the Concorde had never seen, trailing radiation from their transit through the belt. Some of them were venting atmosphere from hull breaches caused by the journey. Some of them had lost crew members to radiation exposure, 4% of all personnel, dead before the battle even began. The rest had kept coming anyway. At the center of the formation was a ship called the Iron Will. It was Admiral Marin's flagship, not the largest ship, not the most heavily armed, but the one every human vessel oriented itself around, the way iron filings orient around a magnet. Marin stood on its bridge, calm as always, his hands behind his back, his gray eyes fixed on the tactical display. "All ships hold position," he said. His voice was quiet and carried no emotion. "Let them see us." The Vraxith fleet slowed. For the first time in the battle, they hesitated. Thiel stared at her display. Her compound eyes processed the data over and over, and each time the answer was the same. That was the human fleet. That was the species the Concorde had classified as too weak to fight. That was the species they had assigned a babysitter. "How?" she whispered. "How is this possible?" On the Dralith flagship, Warlord Kazan saw the human fleet arrive, and felt his blood turn cold. He recognized what he was looking at. Not just ships, but weapons. The humans had mounted kinetic mass drivers on their larger vessels, weapons that fired solid metal slugs at a fraction of the speed of light. They had drone bays, hundreds of them, each carrying swarms of autonomous attack craft that moved with a coordination no organic pilot could match. And on the flanks of the fleet, he saw launcher arrays for something his sensors could not identify. The results came back with a warning label he had never seen before. Unknown weapon class. Theoretical yield exceeds safe parameters. The humans had brought something new to this war, something they had built in silence, in secret, while the galaxy looked the other way and called them weak. Admiral Marin opened a communication channel. Not to the Concorde. He had nothing to say to them right now. He opened a channel to the Vraxith. The face that appeared on his screen was Overmind Selkrath, commander of the Vraxith invasion fleet. Selkrath was ancient, his leather-like skin cracked and scarred from centuries of war. His eyes were black from edge to edge, and they stared at Marin with the cold curiosity of a predator examining something it had not seen before. "You are the humans," Selkrath said. His voice was like gravel dragged across stone. "The Concord's pets, you are in our way." Marin did not blink. He did not raise his voice. "You should not have come here," he said. Selkrath tilted his head. "Is that a threat, small creature?" "No," Marin said. "It is information. You have attacked the Concord. You have destroyed their ships. You have killed their people. That is between you and them, but you are now facing us, and we are not the Concord." He leaned forward, just slightly, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "We are the species that split the atom and used it on ourselves. We are the species that invented 100 ways to kill each other and then invented 100 more. We are the species that crawled out of mud and built machines that can crack open stars. You think you know what war is. You do not. You have fought species that wanted to survive. We are the species that will burn with you, if that is what it takes. We do not bluff. We do not retreat. And we do not forgive." He straightened up. "You have one chance to turn your fleet around. After that, you have nothing." The channel closed. Selkrath stared at the blank screen for a long moment. Then he laughed, a harsh, scraping sound that echoed across his bridge. He turned to his officers. "Destroy them." The Vraxith fleet surged forward, 3,000 warships against 2,000. On the bridge of the Iron Will, Admiral Marin watched them come. His face did not change. He had seen worse odds in human history books. He had read about 300 soldiers holding a mountain pass against an empire. He had read about a single city holding out against a siege for 900 days. He had read about pilots who flew burning planes into enemy ships because surrender was not something they were built for. He opened the fleet-wide channel. Every human ship heard his voice at the same moment. "Weapons free." 2,000 human warships opened fire at once, and the darkness of space turned white. The first 60 seconds of the Battle of the Thaline Breach killed more Vraxith than the entire Concord fleet had managed in 9 hours. The kinetic mass drivers fired first. Solid slugs of tungsten, each one no bigger than a human fist, accelerated to 12% of the speed of light. They crossed the gap between the fleets in the time it takes a heart to beat once. The Vraxith shields were designed to stop energy weapons, beams of light, plasma bursts, the elegant weapons that civilized species used. They were not designed for this. The slugs punched through shields like needles through paper and buried themselves in hull plating with an impact that turned metal into liquid. 14 Vraxith destroyers were gutted before their commanders understood what was happening. Then the drones launched. They came from every human ship at once, tens of thousands of small, fast, autonomous craft that poured into the void like a swarm of angry insects. They had no pilots. They had no fear. They were controlled by battle networks, artificial intelligences that thought faster than any organic brain, that could coordinate 1,000 simultaneous attacks without hesitation, without mercy, without doubt. The drones swarmed the Vraxith fleet, attaching themselves to hulls and detonating, clogging weapon ports, crashing into engine arrays. For every drone the Vraxith destroyed, 3 more took its place. Overmind Selkrath stood on his bridge and watched his tactical display fill with chaos. This was not how war was fought, not in any war he had known. Civilized species fought in formations. They traded fire at range. They maneuvered for position. There was a pattern, a rhythm, a logic to it. Humans had no pattern. They had no rhythm. They fought like something feral, something that had learned to kill before it had learned to think. a human cruiser, half its hull torn open by Vraxith fire, did not retreat. Its crew sealed the damaged sections, rerouted power to its remaining weapons, and accelerated directly into a Vraxith battlecruiser twice its size. The collision destroyed both ships. The humans had done it on purpose. Selcraft stared at the explosion on his screen. "They rammed us," he said. His voice was flat with disbelief. "They deliberately rammed us." "Overmind," one of his officers reported. "We are detecting similar behavior across the engagement zone. Damaged human vessels are not withdrawing. They are accelerating toward our ships." "That is not a tactic. That is madness. It is effective, Overmind. We have lost 47 ships in the last 4 minutes." On the Concorde's retreating diplomatic cruiser, Ambassador Thiel watched the battle from what she had believed was a safe distance. She was wrong about that too. The tactical display showed the human fleet tearing into the Vraxith like a blade through flesh, and the sounds coming over the open communication channels were things she would never forget. She heard human voices, not screaming, not panicking, but talking, calmly, clearly, giving orders, reporting damage, calling out targets. A ship captain whose vessel was venting atmosphere on 3 decks ordered her crew to put on emergency suits and keep firing. An engineering team on a carrier with no functioning engines rerouted the ship's reactor to overcharge its weapons, and turned their dying ship into a stationary gun platform. A squad of Marines, trapped in a breach section with no way out, used their suit thrusters to launch themselves across open space toward a Vraxith vessel and boarded it through a hull crack. They boarded it, with hand weapons, in the vacuum of space. Thiel contacted Warlord Kazan. His face appeared on her screen, lit by the orange glow of weapons fire from his own ship, which had re-entered the battle alongside the humans. His golden eyes were wide. "Kazan," she said, "what are they?" The warlord watched a squadron of human fighters weave through a Vraxith formation, at speeds that should have killed their pilots from the force alone. Humans could withstand more gravitational stress than any Concorde species had realized, not because they were strong, but because they had spent centuries strapping themselves into machines that pushed their bodies to the edge of death, and then slightly beyond. "They do not fight like a species that wants to survive," Kazan said slowly. "They fight like a species that has decided the enemy will not." Thiel watched a human destroyer, burning from bow to stern, fire its last kinetic slug into a Vraxith dreadnought's reactor core. The dreadnought exploded. The destroyer was consumed in the blast. Neither ship survived. But the Vraxith had lost a dreadnought, and the humans had lost a destroyer. The math was simple, and it was horrifying. The battle lasted 2 hours and 19 minutes. In the history of galactic warfare, that was nothing. A skirmish, a footnote. But what happened in those 2 hours and 19 minutes rewrote every assumption every species had ever made about the nature of war. The humans used their unknown weapon, the one Kazan's sensors had flagged with a warning label. They called it Hellfire. It was a missile that, upon detonation, destabilized the nuclear bonds in a localized area. Matter itself came apart. Not an explosion in the traditional sense, more like reality briefly forgetting how to hold itself together. A sphere of unbeing that erased everything it touched. 3 Vraxith capital ships vanished in the first volley. Not destroyed, erased, as if they had never existed. After Hellfire, the Vraxith broke. Selcrath, for the first time in 400 years of conquest, gave the order to retreat. His fleet, what was left of it, turned and ran. They had entered the battle with over 3,000 warships. They fled with barely 1,200. But Admiral Marin did not let them go. This was the moment that separated humans from every other species in the Concorde. When the Wraithari won a battle, they held position and offered terms. When the Dralith won, they roared in triumph and claimed the field. When any civilized species won a battle, they stopped fighting. Humans did not stop. The human fleet pursued the retreating Vraxith across 2 star systems. They chased them through asteroid fields and around gas giants, and through the burning debris of their own destroyed ships. They hunted stragglers with the patience of predators that had spent 1,000,000 years chasing prey across open grassland. Damaged human ships that could not keep up with the pursuit stayed behind and set up ambush positions along the most likely retreat routes, waiting in the dark like traps with teeth. And the entire time, every human ship broadcast the same message on every Vraxith frequency. It played on a loop, over and over, in every language the translation systems could manage. Admiral Marin's voice, calm and flat, and carrying no emotion at all. "We remember everything. We forgive nothing. Run." The Vraxith ran. They ran faster than they had ever moved before, burning engines past their limits, abandoning damaged ships, leaving their own wounded behind. They were not retreating. They were fleeing. There is a difference. Retreating is a military action. Fleeing is what prey does. When it was over, the human fleet stopped. They were deep in space that no Concord map had charted, far beyond the Thaline corridor, surrounded by the wreckage of nearly 2,000 Vraxith warships. Their own losses were heavy, nearly 30% of the fleet that had arrived. Over 600 ships, tens of thousands of human lives. Admiral Marin stood on the bridge of the Iron Will and looked at the field of debris that stretched across his display. His face was the same as it had always been, calm, steady, unreadable. If he felt grief for the dead, he did not show it. If he felt triumph, he did not show that either. He simply began giving orders. "All surviving ships, begin repairs. Recover escape pods, ours first, then theirs. Establish a defensive perimeter. I want scouting parties along the Vraxith retreat vector within the hour." His communications officer looked up from her station. "Sir, the Concorde is requesting contact. The Axis of Elders has called an emergency session." Marin nodded. "Tell them we will be available when we are finished here." "Sir, they say it is urgent." "So is this." He turned back to the display. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of known space, the Vraxith were still running. He intended to make sure they never stopped. In a conference room on a Concorde station 4 systems away, the Axis of Elders convened under emergency protocols for the first time in 600 years. 42 species, represented by their most senior leaders, gathered to discuss a single item: the reclassification of humanity. Ambassador Thiles stood before them. Her bronze exoskeleton was dull with exhaustion. Her compound eyes had seen things in the last 3 hours that would take her years to process. She had been asked to present her updated assessment. She looked at the assembled leaders of the galaxy, beings who had ruled for millennia, who had seen empires rise and fall, who believed they understood the nature of power. "We made an error," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "We looked at their bodies and saw weakness. We looked at their lifespan and saw fragility. We looked at their history and saw chaos. We classified them as prey." She paused. "They are not prey. They were never prey. They are the most dangerous species this galaxy has ever produced, and we invited them in and told them they needed our protection." She let the silence build. "They did not correct us. They simply smiled and waited for the moment when they could show us who they really are." The galaxy held its breath. In the days following the Battle of the Thaline Breach, the communication networks of the Concorde carried only one topic: humans. What they had done, what they were, what this meant for everything. The numbers were passed from species to species like whispered prayers. 2,000 human ships had faced over 3,000 Vraxith warships. a force that had crushed the combined might of the Concord in hours, and had broken them. Not just defeated them, broken them so completely that the survivors had fled beyond the galactic rim and had not been heard from since. The Concord offered humanity everything. Full membership, effective immediately, a permanent seat on the Axis of Elders, the removal of their patron status, access to all Concord technology, trade routes, and military intelligence. Everything a species could want. Admiral Marin accepted the membership. He accepted the removal of the patron status. He accepted the trade routes and the technology sharing. He declined the seat on the Axis of Elders. The refusal sent a shockwave through the Concord that was, in some ways, more unsettling than the battle itself. Every species in the galaxy wanted a seat at that table. Wars had been fought over it. Alliances had been built and broken for a chance to sit among the elders and help steer the course of civilization. And the humans said no. When the Elder Council asked Marin why, he stood before them in his plain, dark uniform, his hands at his sides, and gave an answer that would be studied and debated for centuries. "We did not fight this war for power," he said. "We fought it because someone threatened our neighbors, and we do not tolerate that. We are not interested in ruling the galaxy. We are not interested in telling other species how to live. We want to trade, we want to explore, we want to build, and we want to be left alone." His gray eyes swept across the assembled leaders. "If someone threatens the peace again, we will be there. You will not need to ask. You will not need to beg. We will simply come. That is who we are. That is who we have always been." He turned and walked out of the chamber. The doors closed behind him. 42 species sat in perfect silence and tried to understand what had just happened. They had offered humanity a throne, and humanity had said it preferred to stand. Warlord Kazan Drail met with Marin one last time before the Draelith formally dissolved the patron arrangement. They sat across from each other in a small room on the orbital station Pinnacle, the same station where Thiel had first arrived, where this entire story had begun. The room was plain. 2 chairs, a table, 2 cups of a dark, bitter liquid the humans called coffee, which Kazan had reluctantly grown to enjoy, despite the fact that it was technically a mild poison. Kazan held his cup in claws that could bend steel, and looked at the human across from him. Marin looked the same as he always had, calm, steady, unremarkable, a soft creature in a hard galaxy, the most dangerous being Kazan had ever met. "I have one question," Kazan said. "Ask. How long have your people been preparing for this? The hidden fleet, the weapons, the battle networks, how long?" Marin took a sip of his coffee. He set the cup down carefully. "Since before we knew you existed," he said. "Since before we had faster-than-light travel. Since before we left our own solar system. We looked up at the stars, and we knew, with absolute certainty, that something was out there. We did not know what. We did not know if it was friendly, or hostile, or indifferent. So we prepared for everything." Kazan stared at him. "You built weapons for an enemy you had never met." "We built weapons because we have always built weapons. It is what we do. We see a danger, real or imagined, and we prepare for it. We cannot help it. Our entire history is a record of things that tried to kill us, and the tools we invented to stop them. Disease, famine, weather, animals, each other." He smiled, that same small, closed smile. "Especially each other. You are a terrifying species, Admiral." "We are a frightened species, Warlord. That is not the same thing. But the result, I suppose, is similar." 3 weeks later, Ambassador Thiel published her revised assessment of humanity to the Concord's academic network. It was the longest, most detailed species evaluation ever produced. 400 pages of analysis, observation, and carefully measured conclusions. Within a day, It became the most widely read document in the history of the galaxy. The key section was titled, simply, Understanding Humans, and in it, Thiel dismantled every assumption the Concord had made. She explained that human weakness was not weakness at all. It was the engine that drove everything they were. Their short lifespans did not make them fragile. It made them urgent. They did not waste time because they had so little of it. Their bodies broke easily, so they invented medicine, armor, and machines to carry them where their legs could not. They had no claws, no venom, no telepathy, so they built weapons. And because they had no natural limits on what those weapons could be, they never stopped building. They had no instinct for peace, so they created laws and institutions and treaties to impose it on themselves by force of will. And because they had spent their entire existence fighting the most creative, adaptable, and ruthless enemy imaginable, each other, they had become the most experienced warriors in the galaxy without ever having left their own world. Every weakness was a strength in disguise. Every soft place on their body was a lesson they had learned in blood and then turned into steel. 2 months after the battle, something happened that no one in the Concord expected. A Vraxith diplomatic vessel crossed the galactic rim. It was small and unarmed, and broadcasting a signal of peaceful intent. It did not contact the Concord. It contacted humanity directly. The Vraxith had never, in their entire recorded history, sent a diplomatic envoy to anyone. They conquered, they consumed, they did not talk, but now they wanted to talk. They wanted to talk to the species that had shattered their fleet and chased their survivors into the dark, and broadcast a message of unforgetting on every frequency. They requested a non-aggression pact. Admiral Marin met with the Vraxith envoy personally. The meeting lasted 6 hours. When it was over, a treaty had been signed, the first treaty the Vraxith had agreed to in their existence. Marin had added a single clause that the Vraxith negotiator had accepted without fully understanding its meaning. It stated that any act of aggression by the Vraxith Dominion against any member species of the Galactic Concord would be considered an act of aggression against humanity itself. With one sentence, Admiral Marin had placed every species in the Concord under humanity's protection. Not because anyone asked, not because it was required, because that was who humans were. It was in their nature, the same nature that drove them to build weapons and fight wars and tear each other apart. The same hands that built Hellfire missiles also built hospitals. The same minds that designed battle networks also wrote music. The same species that had nearly destroyed itself a dozen times over also kept choosing, every single time, to rebuild. The Vraxith never crossed the galactic rim again. Years passed. The galaxy settled into a new kind of peace, deeper than before, steadier, built on a foundation that had not existed before the Battle of the Falim Breach. Not the peace of a galaxy that believed nothing bad would happen. The peace of a galaxy that knew something bad could always happen, and that when it did, a species of small, soft, short-lived creatures with fragile bones and stubborn hearts would stand up and fight. Ambassador Thiel visited Earth for the first time on a warm afternoon in spring. She walked through a city park in a place called Geneva, surrounded by green trees and the sound of water and the distant laughter of children. Humans moved around her, walking, talking, sitting on benches, throwing balls for small furry animals that seemed to exist purely for the purpose of being loved. She sat on a bench beside an old woman who was feeding birds. The woman smiled at her and offered her a piece of bread. Thiel did not eat bread, but she took it anyway and held it in her 4 hands and watched the birds gather at her feet. She thought about everything she knew. She thought about the fleet hidden in asteroid belts. She thought about Hellfire missiles and kinetic slugs and drone swarms. She thought about Admiral Marin's calm voice saying, "We remember everything. We forgive nothing." She thought about the species that had split the atom and used it on themselves. and then decided, somehow, to keep going. And she looked at the old woman feeding birds, and the children playing in the grass, and a young man reading a book under a tree. And she felt something that her species had no word for. It was too large, too complex. It had too many sharp edges and too many soft places, and it filled her chest in a way she had not known was possible. The closest human word, she decided, was awe. Not the awe of seeing something powerful. She had seen power before. The Dralith were powerful. The Vraxith were powerful. Power was common in the galaxy. This was the awe of seeing something impossible. A species that should not exist. A species that had no right to be here. That had been broken and burned and frozen and starved and bombed and betrayed by its own kind 1,000 times over. And had stood up every single time and said, again. She looked at the sky above the park, where somewhere beyond the blue, human ships patrolled the borders of a galaxy they had been told they were too weak to protect. She thought of Marin's words, "We want to trade, we want to explore, we want to build, and we want to be left alone." Such simple wants, such a simple species, and yet nothing about them was simple at all. Thiel closed her eyes and recorded one final entry in her personal log. It was short. She had spent years writing hundreds of pages about humanity, and in the end, the truth fit into just a few words. "They did not need us," she said quietly. "And that is the most terrifying and beautiful thing I have ever learned." The birds at her feet ate the bread she had dropped. The children kept laughing. The sun kept shining on a small blue world that had, against all odds, and reason and logic, raised a species that frightened the stars. And somewhere in the dark, on the other side of the galactic rim, the Vraxith listened to the silence where their empire had been, and did not dare to cross it.